All right, so now we can begin. So again, my name is Connor Flanagan. I'm the Director of Education from the Southampton History Museum, and this is my talk on our one-room schoolhouse, which we refer to as the Red Creek Schoolhouse or our 1830 one-room schoolhouse. So before we really get started with talking about the school itself, first I want to go over Red Creek. Where is it? What is it? Everything about it. So Red Creek is an area within the hamlet of Hampton Bays. So Hampton Bays is a hamlet of Southampton town, and originally Hampton Bays was made up of a bunch of small little areas that all had their own names that were settled by a few different families. One of which was Red Creek, which we can see right here on the top of this map. On its left is Southport, and on its right is Squiretown and South Bar. Today, these sort of areas and a few others are still known within Hampton Bays. Rather than being their own hamlets or towns or villages, they're sort of just known areas within Hampton Bays itself. Those areas are Red Creek, Squiretown, Canoe Place, Ponquag, Springville, Ram Pasture, East Tiana, West Tiana, and Newtown. I myself currently actually live in Canoe Place, and I'm actually moving this weekend to now be living in West Tiana. So I'm right smack dab in the middle of this map that we're seeing right now. Red Creek today, as I mentioned before, is still around. It's mostly designated by this road called Red Creek Road, sort of an apt name, that connects Flanders Road to Squiretown Road. If you drive along through that road, you'll notice that it is a mostly wooded area with some residential housing all throughout it. Not really any businesses or anything like that. There is the Red Creek Southampton Town Park, which is a great place to go for leisure activities. There's the animal shelter nearby as well. But for the most part, Red Creek is a very heavily wooded area, a lot of great trails, great access to the water, and a lot of great places to live. So now, Red Creek itself is a small little part of Hampton Bays, as I mentioned. Hampton Bays, sort of the area as we know it today, was originally settled in 1740, and it was actually originally called Good Ground, which was a translation from an Indian word. The word was two youngs, I believe. My pronunciation probably won't be the best, but it was known as that because of its just good ground. It was a really great place to grow things. Settled all around the Hampton Bays area is a lot of pine barrens, there's a lot of sand, it's not the best soil for growing opportunities, but in Hampton Bays, they just had really great soil, and they gave it the very obvious name of good ground. In 1892, the railroad changed the name of Hampton Bays actually to Bayhead. But before the end of that year, actually, the Good Ground community got together and were all very angry that the railroad just decided to randomly change their name and make them put it back to being known as Good Ground. But the name again would change in 1922 when the decision was made to move from Good Ground to being called Hampton Bays. It was originally going to be called Bay Hampton, but I believe it was when they were talking with the United States Postal Service, there was already a place named Bay Hampton Park in Freeport, which is up island, and they didn't want to have two Bay Hamptons on Long Island at the same time, so they decided to switch the name around and call it Hampton Bays as we know it today. The reason for that was at this time, the Hamptons were really kicking off as a really great tourist attraction almost. A lot of wealthy and influential people from the city were coming out to the Hamptons either to live full-time or have second homes or just a vacation, and Hampton Bays wanted to be part of that. While they were part of Southampton town itself, being called Good Ground, maybe they thought you're not going to get as much reputation being there, living there, so a lot of the summer residents who were living there wanted to be part of the Hamptons, which is why they wanted to change the name over. The history of Red Creek itself, though, it is actually one of the earliest places in the Hampton Bays area that was settled, and that's because it is right on the water. actually, what I mentioned before about good ground being translated from a Native American word meaning Tao Youngs, that was incorrect, my mistake. That is actually Red Creek, used to be known as Tao Youngs to local Native Americans. Did not translate to Red Creek. That was just simply the name that we gave it afterwards. But the Native Americans knew it as a great place to find shells to create wampum. So it was a really prized, great area that they enjoyed. It was settled very early by the Europeans because of its proximity to the water. This whole area, while it is sort of away from the rest of the land, separated by a lot of woods, you were right on the water. And at this early time, before the railroad, before roads themselves were put in for cars or horses or anything like that to move people around, water was the easiest way to move up and down the coast of Long Island. So if you were trying to get from Riverhead to Montauk, you would want to probably get on a boat and sail across the Peconic Bay rather than going down and trying to go through Montauk Highway or whatever version of Montauk Highway might have been around at whatever year it was. It was sort of the also the crux, a really great place for the fishing industry prior to the really takeoff of Sag Harbor as sort of like the whaling hub. Prior to Americans going out on long-term whaling ventures, they did a lot of drift whaling. So any place that was very close to the water's edge was a great place to be, because if there was drift whales about, you could launch very quickly and go out hunting for them. Now, Feversham was a place in what we call North Sea today in Southampton, that was known as a really great whaling port, and eventually as time went on, they moved out to Sag Harbor. But fishing industries popped up all over the coasts of Long Island, with Red Creek being one of them. Specifically, they focused a lot of their efforts on the fishing of bunker fish. And actually, there used to be a few little oil refineries where they would actually mill the bunker fish to create fish oil, which was a really important business practice for this area. But moving past the history of Red Creek and Hampton Bays itself, now that we sort of have an understanding and idea of what we're talking about, now we need to learn what is a one-room schoolhouse. It's sort of a fairly common idea. I mean, if you hear the word one-room schoolhouse, you're going to kind of have a pretty good understanding of what these things are, but there are a few other little weird differences. So very easily here, I have it mapped out. A one-room schoolhouse is a one-room structure meant for the education of local children. They're very popular in early America. Sometimes they weren't exactly one room, but still very small. There would maybe be a front entryway, one small room in the beginning, and then the larger classroom, or sometimes split up into two small classrooms. But very often it was just one square room where everybody would go to learn. It would often serve multiple grade levels in one building. So you'd have kids of all different ages, all learning together. And because of this, the teachers relied heavily upon peer teaching or a cooperative learning style, where the teacher would essentially be the head, and they would be the ones deciding what we're going to learn today, sort of dictating lesson plans. And the older students who would maybe have a better understanding of certain materials would be relied upon to help teach a lot of the younger kids, sometimes often their younger siblings, how to, read better or do certain math problems or whatever it is that they might be working on that day. And in early times, this was a luxury that not all children had. This was something that was seen as a privilege. This was something that, today kids are doing anything they can to not go to school, really on any given day. So the idea that just not that long ago, in the grand scheme of human history, kids in America were really excited for the idea that they could go to school and they could learn. When today it's not always seen as that way. What we're going to show you here is a couple different types of one-room schoolhouses, so you get an idea. While I talked about them being mostly these sort of square one-room structures, they did somewhat change, and it really depended on where they were. So this here is known as the Brick School in Warren, Connecticut, as part of the Warren Historical Society. And you can see it's a brick structure, hence the name Brick School, sort of square. And then we have the next one here is the Old Stone School in Rockford, Illinois. This picture is from about 1902. And you can see it has sort of a more pointed roof, and it has that little steeple on the top with a little fence around it. And you can actually see an outhouse out in the background behind the students to the right of the building, which is a very important feature because most of these buildings, especially prior to the time when they would have had any sort of indoor plumbing, had to have a bathroom, but it would not be attached to and actually be somewhere out in the yard. So I can only imagine in wintertime, you can go to the bathroom when you're in school. Probably wouldn't have happened very often. Here we have something affectionately known as the Round School up in Vermont. I assume it gets its name because of its round structure. It has a small little barn to the side. And then the building itself there is a sort of odd round shape. And here we actually have an interior shot of the Red Creek Schoolhouse down in Georgia. So an important thing to take of note in here, well, the outsides would have been different depending on where you were, what type of building materials you had, or if somebody decided to build a round building versus building a square building. The interiors all would have been mostly similar. That being that they would have had a big potbelly stove like this right in the middle of the room. And that was done to give ample heating to everybody in the room. In the wintertime, I would imagine everybody would be clamoring to get these seats right there in the middle, not really in the front, not really in the back, not against the side walls, but as close to there as you could be, so you'd be nice and warm. Sometimes the teacher would often also make some sort of stew as a lunch for the students right there on the stove in the middle. A chore that some students would actually have to do sometimes is go out and get firewood to keep this stove burning in the wintertime to make sure everybody stays nice and warm. They also would have had seats sort of set up just like this. In this schoolhouse here, there's a big sort of conglomeration of chairs that they probably have set up. In our schoolhouse, we used to actually have a setup very similar to this with whatever seats we could get. So we could actually bring students in and they can learn in it. And they also had benches here on the side, which would have been a fairly popular idea as well, depending on the area. If you had a lot of students, you needed to get as much seating as you could out of the place. So as you can see from those pictures, the design, they are fairly small buildings. There's the potbelly stove in the center of the room, as I discussed, for even heat distribution. Sometimes desks for the students, and other times simply benches. So as we saw, if I go back in this picture, we have seated desks with tables sort of in front of them, and other times they would just have benches. So no actual desk per se to do your work on. Sometimes you'd have to just do work on your lap. Other times you would actually be able to, there'd be something coming off the back of the bench, forming a small little desk that you could work on. But it, again, depended on the area and what they had. The building was typically painted either white or red, or sometimes left with whatever natural look it had. So if it was bricks, they'd probably just leave it with a sort of red brick color. But you wouldn't really see a blue schoolhouse or a green schoolhouse or something like that. It was usually just painted white or a red color. And as I mentioned in that picture that I'll go back to right here, the outhouses. So in case anybody doesn't see, I will draw on it here with our fancy little drawing tool. There's an outhouse right over here. And you can sort of tell by how far back it is, it's probably against that back fence. It's probably a good ways away from the building. So again, in the wintertime, if you were trying to use the bathroom or anything like that, you would have to run all the way back there. And I can't imagine really wanting to do that in a snowstorm. But so changes in education from colonial times to the early 1800s. So schoolhouses were in effect pretty much since the beginning of colonial settlement in America. As soon as the adults got here, started working, building industry, they're gonna have all these kids. A lot of them, especially in the lower classes, would have been put right to work. But anybody who had any sort of money or in the upper class, they would have wanted their kids learning more and doing less work, especially physical labor work, that they could have had slaves or any sort of lower class person doing. So they would have started instituting schools pretty quickly. And soon after that, it sort of became something that most kids would be able to try and do, or at least a little bit of. In colonial times, formal education was limited, as I said, to the upper class, and standards differed greatly throughout the 13 colonies. So down in the South, they maybe wouldn't have cared as much about sitting down and having a formal education, because the planting season and the growing season was much longer. You had a lot more time where people needed to work. In the northern colonies, during the wintertime, you can't really grow anything. You can't really do too much farm work. There's still work that needs to be done in all sorts of different industries, but a good segment of the population had some downtime. So rather than just having the kids run around and be annoying and making a mess, you could instead have them go to school and they learn a little bit. So they had a little bit more ample time. So there was different standards of education throughout the country. And most kids would actually take apprenticeships instead of going to school to learn a trade. So you might be 10 years old and thinking, well, do I go to school and learn to read, or do I go and learn how to make barrels really well, so that way I can have a career later in life and make money? Because who cares if I can read? I need to be able to make money. And all types of education were largely based around religion. Again, a reason why some people in the North versus the South were putting more emphasis on education was because if they're going to church and they needed to read, if they had more time in the wintertime to learn, they would want all the kids to be able to read, so that way when they go to church, they could read the Bible well. That was a common book that was kept in most schools as a way to learn how to read, was by practicing reading the Bible. This man over here on the left, his name is Horace Mann. He was the secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education, and he was elected to that position in 1837. And in 1838, he put out the Common School Journal, which had 6 key tenets in it. And he is credited as being really responsible for pushing through a major education reform throughout America. And the reason we're talking about him in particular in this time frame is because our one-room schoolhouse was built around 1830. So right around the time that our schoolhouse was built and kids started getting educated in that structure itself, Horace Mann came out and decided that he wanted to sort of reform how public education was done, not only in his state of Massachusetts, but around the country. His 6 key tenets were: 1, the public school should no longer remain ignorant. 2, that such education should be paid for, controlled, and sustained by an interested public. 3, that this education will be best provided in schools that embrace children from a variety of backgrounds. 4, that this education must be non-sectarian. 5, that this education must be taught using the tenets of a free society. And lastly, that education should be provided by well-trained professional teachers. So basically everything in there is stuff that we actually still practice today in education in our schools around the country. Public schools should no longer remain ignorant. We like to think that all of our schools are not ignorant and they're teaching all the best well-known things first. Education should be paid for by the public. It largely is, especially public schools. That's where your public tax money goes to a lot of the time, is paying for schooling. Education is best provided by schools that embrace a variety of backgrounds. It's been proven by plenty of studies that kids learn best when they are surrounded by all sorts of differences. That's differences in race, gender, religion, ethnicity, everything, socioeconomic levels, everything like that. So that way kids not only learn academically what they need to know, but they also learn socially how to navigate things well. It's a good opportunity for kids to be around as many people as possible. This should be non-sectarian, meaning non-religion based. So while school started with a heavy religious base, the United States was always had the separation of church and state. And if this was going to be something that was mandated by the state, they needed to have that separation. While at this time, they probably weren't thinking about separating too heavily, Christianity and Judaism and Islam, which maybe some people think about today in schools. They were probably more focused on separating like Lutheran teachings from from Catholic teachings, from Protestant teachings, things like that. But wanting to keep all that personally and keeping education non-sectarian as possible. education be taught using the tenets of free society, meaning that people needed to be able to ask questions and be their own free person and learn on their own. And should be provided by well-trained professional teachers. We would all like to hope and think that all of our teachers are the most well-trained and as professional as possible. You don't want your kid going to school and learning from somebody who has no idea what they're talking about. So these are all great tenets that we can all thank Horace Mann for instituting in American public education. Teachers in the 1800s were in some ways similar to today, in some ways very different. One interesting fact, at this time in the 1800s, women weren't always allowed to work in any industry they wanted to. It's a very, very new thing where women are even able to work in some industries today. But this was one job where a single female would be able to become a school teacher without any muss or fuss from anybody. There were sometimes cultural rulings where if a woman got married, she wouldn't be allowed to teach anymore. But any single woman would be able to become a teacher as long as she had the proper education and training to do so. And men were also teachers a lot of the time. Teachers would sometimes live with a local family or in a teacherage being a small accommodation or another building, sometimes attached to the school as like a small apartment for the teacher to live in. You didn't always have the luxury of having somebody that lived in the town grow up to become a teacher, so you'd have to sometimes get a teacher to come into your area, and they would need a place to stay, whether that be a local family or a teacherage, as I mentioned. And as I talked about before, the semester length really depended on how much schooling the kids needed and how much work they needed to do. So if there were areas where there was a long winter, they would have more schooling in places where there was more work that needed to be done in any sort of different industry. Kids would have somewhat shorter schooling. Or maybe they would have more broken up periods of teaching. But that greatly differed around the country. So the students themselves, while more formal and larger public schools began to be used in larger cities around the country and more rural areas, one-room schoolhouses were still in favor in the mid to late 1800s. So with Horace Mann instituting all these new ideas and creating more formalized public education system where kids would go into different age groups and learn in sort of bigger environments, you didn't always have that luxury in these smaller places. So a building like this picture's from 1902. And in this rural area, while for almost 100 years, public education has really been taking huge leaps forward, they still have just a small one-room schoolhouse where you can see some of the kids in the front look a bit younger, with the kids in the back being a bit older. So you still have a couple different grade levels all together. Sometimes you would have kids as young as 4 all the way up to 12 years old learning together. And about age 12, students would either go on to higher education, they would begin to work full-time, or they would get some sort of apprenticeship and turn that into a trade. Along with schoolwork, the students were tasked with all sorts of different chores. Like I mentioned before, they would be gathering firewood to put into their stove in the middle of the room, which again, you can see right here behind that first row of students. That sort of pillar right there is the chimney for the stove. So somebody would have to go out and get the firewood to keep that warm. They would need to maybe clean the erasers, need to get water because again, there'd be no plumbing in the building. So you need to get water to drink and also to wash your hands and things like that if they're going to be eating in the building. And sometimes a lot of these schools would actually have small gardens. So some of the chores may be actually tending to that small garden. But now that we have a basic understanding of where Hampton Bays is, where Red Creek is, the history around those places, and sort of a general idea about one-room schoolhouses themselves, we'll start talking about our building, the Red Creek Schoolhouse. So this extremely not great photo of the building is probably one of the earliest pictures we have of the building from sometime in possibly the 1940s. This is on the property that the schoolhouse used to be on before it was brought to the museum. Here we actually have some pictures that were taken of it talking about or showing the old construction. So a few years ago, the building went under a reconstruction where we stripped it away as it was starting to fall apart and become really a danger to the public. It was an open building. People would be able to go inside of it all they wanted and check it out and explore. As a director of education, I did plenty of education programs where I'd bring kids inside the building and we'd learn about colonial America. But the building began to become unsafe. So we were able to get a grant and start doing work on it. And in doing so, we actually got a chance to find out really how old it was. We sort of guessed before, saying about 1850. But through its reconstruction and examining the wood and the different joinery involved and the nails and things like that that were used in it, we were able to more accurately date the building to about 1830. And this is just one of the pictures showing a few different old types of joinery and old types of nails that were used inside of the building. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna start back from its earliest location and moving forward to today. So its earliest known location is shown here on this map, which is the 1858 Chase map of Suffolk County, New York. We actually had this map at the Rogers Mansion. So in the future, when we're actually able to have guests there again, if you do ever want to see it, is in the office hallway. So it's not in the main exhibit space, but if you ask any of the staff that works there to see the Chase map, we can just take you back in there. It's hanging up on the wall. And this is a map of all Suffolk County. And if you find the one small little area in the bottom where they're talking about Red Creek, or showing Hampton Bays, you can find the Red Creek area and you'll find Southport. So Southport was this little jetty. Again, I'll draw so you can see a little better. The sort of little peninsula right here. There's some reports that it may have been a small island that was then manually filled in over time, or maybe environmental changes causes become filled in with a bit of a sandbar jutting out to the water. But this area was known as Southport, and it was settled largely by the Terry family. Right here, this is Jesse Terry, J. Terry. He was a farmer, fisherman, businessman, and was credited with helping to establish Southport as a really thriving area in the early 1800s. His family ran all sorts of different businesses all over the place. We see another H. Terry right there. And we see right here an oil factory. That's one of those bunker fish oil factories that I was talking about before. There's also a grist mill, a general store, and a shipyard. That was all in this area that was run by the Terry family. Legend has it, oral history has it, that the Terry family were the ones that originally constructed the schoolhouse to educate not only the children of the Terry family, but also all the other families that lived in the area. We have W. Foster, S. Foreigner, I believe, S. Robinson, and J. Hildreth. Any of them that had kids and they were living in this area probably would have all attended the Red Creek Schoolhouse, which is listed as being right out over here in the Southport area. And again, this map was from 1858. The next map we have here is from 1873. It is the Atlas of Long Island by Beers, Comstock, and Klein. And it's showing the second location of the schoolhouse. So the original location that we had was, pulling up my drawing tool. The original location was about up over here, and it was actually moved 1.25 miles down the road, all the way down over here to school, where it says on the map where it says school. So it was moved down there. There's plenty of different reasons why it might have been moved. The Terry family at this point might not have been around or as heavily important in that area. There may be, as you can see, there's a lot more people living up and around this road. I know the other map that I showed you the clipping of, it didn't have as pulled out of view, but there was nowhere near as many of these families living in this area. So this might have been a better area for the building to be. And at this time, it was pretty commonplace to move buildings around. I know it sort of seems like a crazy thing today, but it didn't have a real foundation. It didn't have a big basement or anything like that. And it's a fairly small building itself. So it wouldn't have been too difficult to put on rollers and pull down the road to replace over here. Again, this is from 1873. This is the second known location of the structure. Moving along to here, sometime between 1873 and 1878, the building moved about a mile, 0.8 miles northeast. And this is where it actually officially became part of the public school system. So the building, it would have been a little bit more down the road this way, but it was actually moved up over here. We don't have a great map showing this location in 1878. So I grabbed a screenshot of Google Maps to sort of show you. It was sort of around this area by Red Creek Road and Red Cedar Point Road and Upper Red Creek Road. A lot of reds in those street names. But it was out in the woods somewhere just about there is where the building would have been put. And we know from deeds talking about when the public school system was sort of restructuring districts, that this was the year that this building sort of became part of the official school district area in Hampton Bays. A few other maps we have from 1894 and 1902 show the building where it is. It's in the same area. I know the maps are structured slightly different. One's a little bit more accurate than the other realistically, but it shows the building designated in the same area, right on that corner of Red Creek, Upper Red Creek, and Red Cedar Point Road. Here is another map, again, a little bit later in 1916, showing it in the same area. So it actually sat on that same location for a very, very long time, from about 1873 until about 1926, when it moved to its fourth location. This here is a tax map showing the property that was attributed to one William W. Hubbard, who purchased the building and moved it to his property about 0.43 miles southwest. Here we have W.W. Hubbard himself. He was born November 9th, 1874, and he actually grew up in the area, and he actually was a previous student of the building. So he lived in the area. He actually went to school there. Later in life, he became a farmer. He was a highway foreman, and later on in life was a real estate broker, but also mixed in between there, he was a school teacher. Not only a school teacher just in general, but a teacher at the building itself as well. So he was a student of the Red Creek Schoolhouse. He was a teacher of the Red Creek Schoolhouse. And later in life, he actually purchased it, as I said, in 1926, moved it to his property, and used it as a storage building. Here we have a picture of it where it's on the property he owned sometime in the 1940s. As I said, as a storage building, he would have used it to store hunting equipment, boating equipment, things like that, for him to go and make use of. Its final location, or I guess almost final location, we'll get into that in a second. So it's like final and a half location. It was moved in 1953 by the Southampton Colonial Society when they purchased it. The Colonial Society is the same as the Southampton History Museum today. It just has a different name. But they purchased the building and moved it to the property. And it was actually moved via barge through the Shinnecock Bay. All its previous moving was just sort of up and down Red Creek Road, somewhat simple to do on rollers. Getting it all the way from Red Creek to Southampton, a little bit difficult. So they actually moved it onto a barge and sailed it down and around, which I wish there were pictures of that. That'd be really great to have. But pictured here is a building shortly after being moved during a winter in the 50s, with a snow-covered top and snow all around the grounds around it. And here we have some interior shots of the building from 2015. So as I mentioned before, we had that old building. I believe it was the schoolhouse from Georgia, showing the interior, and they had that sort of mishmash of desks of all sorts. As you can see in 2015, we had about the same. There were some issues with the way that the building was established. So I'll pull up my draw tool again. So we have these desks sitting this way, essentially set up in the right way. It's just sort of, they're all sorts of different crazy looking desks. But a big glaring issue that I first noticed when I came in to work at the museum was location of the potbelly stove. The stove itself should be dead center in the middle of the room to heat everybody nice and evenly. You would never have it on the side like that. The chimney also, as we saw in the previous picture, and we'll see again in a little bit, wouldn't have existed. They would have had a chimney right up through the top. Now there was no way for me to really know that without, without us opening up the building's walls and getting inside of it. But to me, it didn't make any sense knowing the history of one-room schoolhouses. They would have had a flue going out the middle of the roof or something like that. But this is what it was originally. And, when I got there, we moved stuff around a little bit, try to get it set up when we could do education programs before the remodel occurred. Let's see, here is an exterior shot. This is actually from 2014. So you can see we have the front door here with the glass panes in the windows, these great red shutters, and the windows here, the 2/2. I believe not all the windows were the same at this point. In the next shot, we have a couple different side views of it. Sorry, it's not exactly spaced well, but you can see there's these 2x2s, and this one up here, it's not even a 2x2, it's just a full window. These weren't exactly historic to the time, especially 1850, 1830. They would have had different layouts of windows with either 3x3s or 6/6. The mullions would have been a lot smaller. So different things like that, where windows, they need to be replaced over time, and they just replaced them as best they could. But there's things like that. You can see a lot of damage to the roof just over time, just getting worn away from snow and rain and things like that, to the point where the building was in really bad shape. So what we did was we had a historic structure report done. That was done by Sally Spanberg, who is a really great preservation activist and somebody that has worked really hard to maintain a lot of historic buildings in the whole South Fork area. Specifically in Southampton, she's done a lot of great work. And part of that was doing this historic structure report, which led to a lot of these architectural drawings that we now have showing the exact building of the structure. So we have here the first floor plan and the first floor framing plan, the roof plan and the roof framing plan. And I know there's a lot of numbers and stuff on here, and if you're really interested in this, I know you maybe want to read all this stuff, but I'll show you afterwards where this is all available to the public for free. Here we have the south elevation, which would be the front door, and the west elevation. Then we have the north elevation and the east elevation. And here we sort of have a cutout showing the interior of it, all the sort of joinery and things like that. And then we move on to the actual beginning of the reconstruction. So that historic structure report was done in 2016. My personal history of the museum is I started working as an intern in 2015, and in the summertime, and I believe it was late July, early August, I started the project of doing a bit of research on the schoolhouse myself, talking about our need and the need for doing a bit of reconstruction and figuring it out. The next year, 2016, Sally Spanberg did the historic structure report, and in 2017, we actually got started doing the work there. I came back to work in the museum in 2016, so I got to see all this sort of continue on after my original internship, thinking that the schoolhouse needed a little bit of work. So here we are in March of 2017, and pictured here you can see Nathan Tuttle, who was the carpenter that did all the work. He's doing a little bit of preliminary work, probing some holes in the wall, popping off a few of the wall panels that were a little damaged already, sort of get a look at the inside and see what he was going to be working with, and so we can start formulating a plan for what needed to be done. Here we have, in late March, early April, we started taking everything out of the building. By we, I mean mostly me, carrying out all those desks, placing them in one of the other barns for storage purposes, and clearing out space so the work could really start beginning in earnest. And then later on in April, Nathan began the work of popping everything off the walls and just started to expose everything that was in there. A lot of the work on the interior, the wainscoting and stuff like that, we really thought wasn't historic, and we needed to remove it and get down to the bones of the building itself, which we're in dire need of support. And in doing so, we found some really great artifacts. Pictured here, when we started removing the old plaster and wood panels from the walls, we uncovered these fantastic old chalkboards that were just covered up inside the wall whenever they did some sort of remodeling. As you can see here, it says, I'll grab my drawing tool real quick, 1892, I believe. And it says September. So sometime in September 1892, somebody drew these things. It might have been an old teacher, or it might have been some students. Here, I believe maybe it says Miss Newton, who, sorry, that was a terrible drawing I just did. Miss Newton, better underline. Maybe as they were doing some remodeling, she did some drawings, or had the students come in and do some drawings. Not sure, but it was a really fantastic find. We were so excited when we saw this. What we actually did was we protected this as best as we could as we took it off the wall, because it did need to be removed. And we have it in sort of large chunked pieces in storage at the museum. The hope would be maybe one day, if we did an actual physical exhibit on this, I could take these out. We could sort of piece it back together and put it out for people to examine. It's just a really interesting, cool piece that we were able to find. We had absolutely no idea that was in there. So it was really, really interesting to find it. There's a few other sketches and drawings and writings on the walls as well, but this was the most exciting with the large portrait of this guy there. So here we go. So moving forward, we have the demolition of a lot of the buildings. So as we were talking about the chimney, we found it to completely be non-historic. So we began the process of removing the chimney. The building itself was going to be moved once again. So as I was talking about before, it came to its final resting place, but not really its final resting place. We didn't move it very far. We just moved it slightly on our property. But in doing so, we would need to remove the chimney anyways, rebuild it. But we also discovered that it just really wasn't historic. So it was fully removed from the structure. And here I have a few videos. I'm not sure how they'll play. I know this one might be a little loud. So I'm going to turn the volume down on it. But it's Nathan actually doing some work. So cutting out some of the floorboards and starting to uncover what was actually beneath the floor inside the buildings. That's his son Jonathan, who's helping him out with a lot of the work. They were pulling out the floorboards. I'll pause that. And over here is actually a nice video that Nathan did talking about a bit of the schoolhouse. So I'll play this in full. It's about a minute long. Hopefully it plays okay for everybody.
Welcome to another episode of the Mr. Untitled Schoolhouse. This is the beadboard on the bottom, except it's not beaded, and I'm not convinced it's original. This looks like the top of the rail that is buried underneath the wainscoting and letters from 1892. So you can see a little bit of a roundover, and then it's nailed down into these horizontal roof boards. There is a couple indications, if you get up there really close, that there's a mortise and tenon with the stud up into the head. So I'm not sure if those were changed. And if you go up to the ridge up in the attic there, it looks like, if you shoot kind of that way, that I'm having a feeling that some of these rafters have been changed, that they weren't original. And you can see the spacing on the floor joist is about 32 inches, and they are 3x6s laid in the dirt. I'm assuming they were there when it was moved in 1950. Oh, and there is above where the chimney and then the fireplace or the wood stove wasn't there, there is some rot in the top plate across there. I'm guessing because that's the back side of the chimney and probably leaked in around the flashing of the chimney.
So there's that video. Hopefully it played nicely for everybody. But that was Nathan going through the building and exploring some of the damages he was finding and some of the historic markers starting to clue us into really how old the structure was. So that was me filming. As you've noticed, there was a lot of damage inside. There was, at one point you maybe saw there was like sort of that beat up old beehive. We found a lot of old sort of beehives that had been in there up in the attic eaves that nobody had ever seen before. a lot of water damage leaking in. So the building was definitely in a lot of disrepair. And if it had been left for another few years, it probably would have just collapsed in on itself. I'll try and skip to the next one. Oh, there we go, sorry. So moving forward again, as time went on, Nathan continued with this work, and we got to this point later on in the year. Before any plaster work had been done, Nathan was able to fix up all the inside. We essentially tore the building almost completely down to its bones. Nathan bolstered what needed to be bolstered. We put in new beams where it needed new beams, but the skeleton of the building itself was almost completely original. And we reconstructed around it as best as the ability as we could to the old methods used. And Nathan is seen here putting a nice seal on the floor to keep it nice and safe throughout the years. And moving along, by the end of 2017, the main construction of the building had been completed. The chimney had been removed, which originally would have been right there visible between those two windows. The siding, the roofing, the interior work was for the most part all done. The plaster work, I believe, was completed the following year because it began to become a little too cold to get that all done. But by wintertime, we were in a really great place to put the project on hold, put a wreath on the doors decoration for the wintertime, and move on along. One other thing that I unfortunately don't have a great picture of because I haven't been able to go back to the museum recently due to all the concerns right now, but we actually have a really great lock on that building where it's an old lock from the mid 1800s that's opened one of those big sort of skeleton key looking things. So it's just a really great other fun, interesting thing when I go to open it up to bring kids in there. I don't just pull out a normal little key with a padlock. You know, you get to pull out like a big sort of exciting key that everybody really enjoys. Pictured here in the spring of 2018 was the beginning process of moving the building. So we actually dug out a new foundation behind it, and the project began to fill in that foundation, get it set up and ready, and then move the structure backward onto it. Thankfully, that pole was there because that was actually used as a anchor for the pulley system that was used to drag the building backwards. And then you see the outhouses that we actually have on the left side of the picture there. They were behind there, sort of where that foundation was. We already had them. They weren't associated with the school building, but they always were a nice addition to it when talking about one-room schoolhouses. And when the schools moved backward, we had to move those, and now they are flanking the building on either side. One's a boys' room, one's a girls' room. So when talking about the one-room schoolhouse, and we want to bring up where's the bathroom, it's great to point out the window and have them right there. Pictured here, as you remember before, we had this sort of mishmashed, sort of weird desks. And actually here we have these white desks that Nathan built for us, custom made to fit inside there, matching what the look of some old school desks actually would have been like that maybe would have been in that building. So now when we have students come by to learn about the one-room schoolhouse, they're actually able to sit down at these desks and learn about them. One interesting fact, because as you look at them, there's desks in the back, seats in the front, but how would somebody in the front be able to sit down and write what they were doing? And that is because in these one-room schoolhouses, as we mentioned before, having a lot of different age groups, you would have had younger kids sitting in the front with older kids sitting in the back, and you would have younger kids sitting in the front who maybe couldn't read or write yet, so they didn't need the access to the desk themselves. And down in the back, they would have maybe 2 chairs in the back to sit behind that last desk and do some work. And then pictured here on the side is Jonathan Tuttle, who is Nathan Tuttle's son, who helped a lot with a lot of the work. And pictured here, he's actually getting ready to install the potbelly stove, or not exactly a potbelly stove, but our wood burning stove right there in the middle, where it should have been all along, to demonstrate giving up even heating and actually doing a little bit of cooking and things like that for the students in the classroom. And then what we have here is a great shot of the building. Once it's been moved back, a little bit of work was done after this to sort of fix up the foundation, of course, move a lot of that dirt that's sort of excess in the back. But at this point, the building, the progress was almost completely done. The only reason we were able to do this whole project was thanks in part to the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, who actually awarded the museum a $50,000 grant to get a lot of this work done. And it was just a really fantastic job. They came by and did plenty of inspections as the project was being done to make sure things were being done correctly and according to the specs we laid out in the beginning. And they were extremely pleased with it. They came by, we had a nice little reception with about, I believe there's about 40 or 50 people were all there enjoying the schoolhouse. I gave a quick lesson to everybody about it. And I personally was really excited when the building was completed, because then I could get back to using it for what its original intention was. And that was education. What you can see here are a few pictures. These are actually, I believe they were first graders from OLH, Our Lady of the Hamptons, who came by for a field trip. I believe this was only about a month or two after the construction was basically done. So you can see me in the picture here, surrounded by the school children, getting ready to go into the building and learn about colonial America and how these old schoolhouses worked. And here you see a couple kids sitting in the benches with their slate boards in front of them, listening to me sort of pontificate about the importance of education. But of course, there was a little bit too many kids in this group to all fit in there at a time, so we rotated them out so everybody get a chance to sit down there and sort of experience the room. I've done these programs plenty of times since then with all sorts of different kids from Tuckahoe School, Southampton Elementary School, OLH, coming by to learn in this building that was previously used by plenty of other kids. So it's really fantastic to be able to have this building that was originally used for the education of school children, now again being able to be used for the education of school children. It's on our property, so while we are closed now to the public, all of you are more than welcome to come by, walk around the property, explore it, check it out. The door's closed, but the windows are fairly low, so you can always peek right in. And when we open back up, you'll be able to go in and check it out. And when we're able to do field trips again, I'd love to have any and all kids come. So if any of you watching now have kids that are in school and you would like your kid to come here with their class, simply tell their teachers that you would love for them to come by the Southampton History Museum and learn about our one-room schoolhouse. All of our field trip and education programs are always 100% free, which we'd love to be able to do. That way all kids can be able to come and make this sort of direct connection to their local history, which otherwise they might not be very able to do. So with that, that is the end of my talk, the end of the story of the one-room schoolhouse, starting with its construction, with the Terry family, all the way to today with me teaching the kids how to write with quills and different things like that inside the building. If anybody has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. There is a Q&A function for those of you watching on Zoom right now. If you go to your toolbar, there's a button that says Q&A. You can click that, and there's a section to submit questions. And for any of you that are watching on Facebook, in the comment section, you can comment in there, and I will answer some of your questions. So I'll be more than happy to answer any questions people may have right now. Give a minute for people to submit if you have any. You can take a sip of water. Let's see, we have one. So how many students would they typically have at a time? So students, it really depended on the schoolhouse itself, where it was located, how many students were needing to be schooled, and the size of the building. So our building, most likely, because it was fairly small, you wouldn't have had more than 12 kids or so probably at a time in there. Any more than that, it probably would have been way too cramped to actually get anything done. And some other schoolhouses that I've been to were a bit larger. So if anyone's familiar with the Quag Historical Society, I believe at the library in the back, they have the schoolhouse. I know they were under construction last year. I don't know where they were at as far as being done or not, doing a fix up of the property. I assume they're closed now, but they have a schoolhouse there that's like a one-room schoolhouse. I do the quotes because it does sort of have like that front little foyer to like hang stuff and then opens up to the large room. but it's very big. It's probably about 1.5 times bigger than our building. So they probably could have had, upwards of 30 kids in that building. I don't know the exact history of it, but where it was, they might have had a need for more students to be in there simultaneously, which would be really great. So our next question, around what age did students stop attending school? So students stopped going to school. It really, again, depended. A lot of the stuff changed a lot. Most kids would go and get to about 12 years old. That was sort of a standard for mid 1800s. After that point, some kids, if they did well in school, if they enjoyed school, and then also if their family had the means to do so, they would go on to a high school or a college or some sort of, sometimes a finishing school, as they would call it, to sort of learn about things in more depth, and maybe go on to become a lawyer or a doctor or a teacher themselves, perhaps. But around that time also, especially if you didn't have the money, if your family didn't have the means to do anything like that, it was because you needed to learn how to do whatever your family trade was. Become a farmer, become a blacksmith, a carpenter, a cobbler, a cooper, any sort of different trade, so that way you can start contributing to your family's income. So sometimes from there, they'd go on to just learning a trade or working or whatever else might be. Especially in this area in the mid 1800s, whaling was a extremely popular thing. Kids, even younger than 12, sometimes around 10 years old, would become cabin boys on whaling ships and go out to sea. Many times they wouldn't even know how to read before they went on their first whaling trip. So it was very commonplace for something like that to occur. But as time went on and education became a more standardized and important thing, kids would stay in school for a little bit longer. They would go to school a bit more. So that would be about the time they stopped going to these one-room schoolhouses, was about 12 years old. Let's see if we have any more questions. So we have something in the chat function. Okay, we have another question here. Let's see. Thank you. It is our belief that my husband's aunts and uncles attended this building until around 1905, 1906. We want to get back up to Long Island and take some pictures. That was from Sue Geyer. Yeah, that'd be fantastic. If, anytime between now and later that you want to come back up to Long Island and take a look at the building, feel free to do so. You can always come onto the property and take a look. As I said before, unfortunately, we are closed right now, so you won't be able to go inside of it and things like that. But when things get back to somewhat normal, if you're able to get back up here, be more than happy to, I'll give you a tour, I can meet you there, take some pictures of it. And it'd be really great to find out if your aunts and uncles did actually attend that school. I don't know offhand how long this building was a school for. I do know that it went into the early 1900s, I think. Remembering correctly, it ended around 1912 when this building was not in use anymore. I would have to double check my notes. But I do remember that in the Southampton town historian, in their archives, they have a lot of the school records and like the board meeting minutes and stuff like that, talking about the school, who was the schoolmaster at the time, things like that. They might have record of students, which would be really interesting. But I haven't looked at that material in a few years. For this lecture today, I was mostly referencing a lot of my notes that I used for research that I did a few years ago. So don't remember offhand, but it'd be really great to look back at that stuff and find out. Let's see, another one from John. Let's see, thanks so much for this great piece of Hampton-based history. I live in Red Creek and walk this area frequently. I have found interesting sites around that area, big concrete basins out in the southward salt marshes, also remnants of a dam structure, maybe for cranberry harvesting. Just wonder if there's any history of the Hubbard estate. Again, thanks. So I don't know anything really about the Hubbard estate. But what I do know is that, as I mentioned before, Southport was a really big industrious area. They had a lot of people doing a lot of work out there because of the Terry family. What you probably came upon, those concrete basins, were probably remnants of some of the stuff that he had out there. They had a grist mill, the general store, He was really big into not cranberries, but strawberries. I don't know all the particulars around growing strawberries or what's needed and structure-wise, things like that. But maybe what you found were some sort of remnants of that. Or it could be cranberries as well. I'm not exactly certain. But the Southport area used to be heavily industrious up until the around 1870s when the railroad system came in. Because at that point, you could just take the railroad and come out to the east end of Long Island much simpler. And then quickly after that, in the early 1900s, with the invention of cars and implementation of highways, things like that, water travel just became sort of not a normal activity for the general people coming to and from. So this area just sort of became not as important, and sort of people dissipated, and now it just became a sort of residential area as it is today. Growing up, I had a friend that lived on Red Creek. So I grew up going there all the time myself and driving around those sort of windy back little roads, a little creepy at nighttime. But it's a great place, a really beautiful area. So yeah, I've actually driven around and walked around in the woods on the maps that I mentioned before. I'll pull them up, trying to find roughly where the school was in this area. I pulled around, and I think I just parked in somebody's driveway. Probably shouldn't do that. And I was just sort of walking around the woods trying to see if I could find any remnants of, like an old foundation or something. I couldn't really find anything, but it was sort of interesting to do. But if nobody else has any questions, I'm going to turn off the lecture for now. But again, I want to thank everybody for joining us today and learning about the Red Creek Schoolhouse. Yeah, thank you again. If you want to come to any of our next lectures, if you go to our website, southamptonhistory.org/calendar, you'll see our calendar listing of all of our future events and programs. You can RSVP for them on there. Next week's lecture is actually going to be a really great one. It's being done by my coworker, Mary Cummings, on Thursday at 11 a.m. And that's going to be highlighting a woman from our Gilded Age exhibit. So if any of you are not familiar, you didn't get a chance to see our Gilded Age exhibit last year before we closed for the winter, and then before we sadly had been closed now in the spring. We were highlighting the stories of 12 different women who lived in Southampton during the Gilded Age. And what we're going to be doing is doing some of these lecture series while we're closed. We're going to be highlighting a few of the women from there. So Mary Cummings will be talking about one of them next week. It'll be a shorter lecture, probably only about 20 minutes or half an hour, not a full hour, but a great little informative piece. And then on Tuesday, we have our next cabin fever therapy program, which is meant for you, the community, to sort of get together and chat about different topics. Last week, we were talking about genealogy and some of the resources that the Rogers Memorial Library has as far as doing research like that. And this week, we're going to be sharing travel stories. So while we can't travel now, we're encouraging people to join the Zoom program and just chit chat and talk about some great travel stories they might have, listen to others, and just a way to sort of connect with each other during these times. So again, I want to thank everybody for joining me today, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. All right, thanks everybody. Have a good day.